Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network. Hello and welcome to another edition of Paranormal Dimensions. I'm David Young, and contrary to some of the rumours, that is not me chanting on the theme music. Anyway, I've got a fantastic guest for you today, Peter Robbins. I'm sure many of you will know of that name, and he's got some fascinating things to talk about here. So I think I'll waste no more time. I'm going to introduce Mr. Peter Robbins. Are you there, Peter?
Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peter. Lovely to speak to you. I think we ought to start by saying, how did you originally become interested in the subject of UFOs?
It was not an interest that I chose. I guess you could say it goes back to adolescence, when I was a very nerdy little American kid growing up in a village about 30 miles east of New York City, where I was born and lived most of my life, with very unsophisticated. My interests at that time ranged from collecting rocks and bugs and stamps. I read a lot of books. I was a Boy Scout. A very innocent time in America to a great degree, and certainly for me. And I have two great sisters. My sister Helen passed in the year 2000, but at the time we were playing on the front lawn and just goofing around as kids do sometimes. It was late morning, a beautiful either late spring or early summer day, not a cloud in the sky, and I caught something out of my right peripheral vision in the sky and called her attention to it with either saying, "Look," or "Helen." I've relived this event years after the fact 3 times in 3 different therapeutic sessions to confirm for myself the details of it. And out of the upper right of our field of vision, 5 silvery white disc-shaped objects, elliptical, like holding a dinner plate at a slight angle, away from yourself, came roaring in without a sound in a very precise kind of V, as in Victor, a V formation. And it was completely riveting. In fact, I guess you could say the most impacting moment of my life in terms of the effect it had on it. They were close enough that we could both see that they were metallic, not shiny, bright like stainless steel, like a brushed aluminum maybe, subdued, but metallic. And also close enough that we could both clearly make out regular detailing around the edge of each that was lighter, that after the fact, the only thing I could compare it to was windows on a commercial airplane at an appreciable distance. And we looked, and we looked, and we looked, and we didn't say a word to each other. We were standing about 6 feet apart from each other, she to my left. But I have a very clear memory of the reaction that I experienced. And it's one that I have certainly documented or confirmed with, I'm sure, more than 100 people over the years in various investigations. I've come to call it the checklist reaction. And it's simply a matter of all of a sudden your attention is called to a unfamiliar object or objects above you, and your logical mind clicks through everything that they are not in your experience. Planes, kites, blimps, balloons, helicopters, strange shaped clouds, reflections from the ground, birds, flotsam and jetsam. And again, I'm an adolescent, 13, 14 years old. The only take I had ever had, one would think, oh, gee, kids are so interested in this stuff and it captures every young person's imagination. It really was not something I had given any real thought to, except the fun that it was to get scared in, the movies that I saw growing up at our little local theater and occasionally on television. This was long enough ago that it was the golden age of American B movies, low production values, usually black and white.
Yeah, pretty hilarious, most of them.
Yeah, and I knew that flying saucers, as the term was back then, it was already UFOs officially, but I was familiar with flying saucers, that they were real in the movies. But I guess I had intuited the adult world's message that they were fantasy. And that was fine with me. It just never went beyond that. Many years ago, in trying to attack the credibility of this account that my sister and I had gone public with, the arch American debunker Philip Klass suggested that I had a subconscious memory of an issue of Life magazine some years before. That was a big weekly in America for decades. I'm not even sure what I could compare it to in the UK. But that I had heard about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, which was, in fact, broke through into popular culture rather than just ufology when the event became public in 1965. It had happened in 61. And that somehow had been activated for me in my overactive little mind and my sister's, or that these movies had that kind of influence on me that Helen and I needed to feel special. He wrote about this. He's gone now, I'm pleased to say, in a book called UFO Abductions, A Dangerous Game. And it's something that I found myself at one point joking with Travis Walton about, because he tried to take us down in different chapters in the same book. Wow. Anyway, we're looking and looking and looking, and I go through everything I think they are in my mind, and then in my 14-year-old reality, I start to feel very desperate and quite a loneliness I can only describe as almost cosmic, where somebody else might feel a cosmic connection with the universe. I also knew, because flying saucers were the subject of humor in American popular culture at the time, and to a degree still, same in the UK, that this was a subject that you could be made fun of for taking seriously. Yeah, I understood that.
Yeah.
And I was just, again, a short, geeky, glass-wearing kid, not into sports. I had enough issues on my plate. Desperately wanted a girlfriend or some kind of, adolescent sexual contact. And I also understood that if I told one girl about this, every girl in my town would know, and I'd never get to make out with any of them in my life. And I'm only half kidding. These were the things that were going through my mind at the time. And it went on and on. They just sat there. For what Helen and I ultimately judged was a matter of minutes, which is forever, especially in kid time. Yeah. And at a certain point, David, I had it. My anxiety had peaked to such a point that I turned on my heels and went to run into the house to tell our mom, who was in the kitchen making lunch for us. And I have had people kind of stop me here in relating this narrative and say, come on, this is the most amazing moment you've ever had in your life. You know logically they're going to disappear at any point. How could you take your eyes off them? My sister's reaction, by the way, was just that. She couldn't take her eyes off them and was not feeling anxious. A bit younger than me, still on the cusp of childhood, not feeling threatened by this. This is something that I only learned about 14 years later because that memory was repressed. And when it came back, my life changed that day dramatically. But in the moment, I had it and was running into the house to tell Mom. And then several things happened in the same moment. I was running diagonally across our front lawn to where it intersected with a concrete walkway that was just, a few meters from our front door. And within 2 or 3 seconds, and I'm moving at pretty fast kid speed there, I had an experience I had never had before or since. And it was so profound that it completely took my attention away from the most amazing thing that I had just seen in my life a second before, which was I felt as though I was running through honey or molasses. Everything seemed to slow down so dramatically that I was really completely taken by it. No fear, no anxiety. It was simply fascinating. And my last 3 memories before everything went blue for a split second and then went black and I passed out or was knocked out or however you want to see it, were number 1, my mother was a great gardener and her hydrangea bushes in the front of the house were just beautiful that day. What I was not aware of, so to say, was my motor functioning was not really working at this moment. I was going down. I was falling down in slow motion. And again, no fear, just fascinated. And at that point, the sidewalk, the concrete walkway is starting to get closer and closer. And my vision is fixed on the scoring mark. You know how they score sidewalks, I think in parts of the UK too. Yeah. And on older sidewalks, they break up. Ants make their little civilizations there. And this little ant colony is starting to get bigger and bigger in my eyes. Bugs fascinated me. I was more interested as a kid. I mean, this is all what was going on in this matter of seconds. And I think it's important to share because there are people out there saying, this is really interesting, or I'm not sure if I buy this guy, or, oh my God, I remember the same thing happening to me in so many words when I had my experience. And my thought there was, oh, look, a colony of ants. When I was a little kid, I killed a lot of them and then had this epiphany that you shouldn't kill bugs because they're living things, and I don't do that, and high ants. And then my very last thought before everything, the lights turned out, was what a beautiful day this is. Not, there are 5 UFOs hanging in the sky above me and my sister's right there. It makes no logical sense at all. In the many years that I worked as Bud Hopkins' assistant, I lost count of the number of firsthand, very credible accounts on this variation of, gee, my attention is taken off onto this goofy thing, and I'm not scared. I'm just having a good time now, where a moment ago I was highly anxious, looking at something that represented the entire unknown, and bang, I'm out. Well, at a certain point, I wake up, and my first sense of things was a wave of anger that I quickly repressed, because nice children are not brought up to, be really angry. And I realized that there was kind of a throbbing in my right forearm. Now, I say this with the understanding of having audio tapes of me reliving this. And years later, when I decided to explore this in regressive hypnosis, I waited until I was really ready. And I had access to several extraordinary practitioners of regressive hypnosis, one being Bud Hopkins, my mentor and the best known and most respected leader, father figure in a way of rational scientific investigation of this very complex aspect of UFO studies, the abduction phenomena.
Absolutely.
The other was another mentor who was a tough, no-nonsense Italian-American New York City police detective. I mean, a real American archetype. Detective Sergeant Pete Mazzola, who was a crack UFO investigator, but also a highly decorated cop. And in the 1970s had been trained, one of 3 cops, as I recall, trained by the New York City Police Department to do hypnotic regression for criminal investigation. And he was the first person I knew that was doing it with witnesses, experiencers, abductees, and then using the voice stress technology apparatus at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. Now you can get polygraph hardware that you can put on your laptop. Back then, this was major and different. I only bring this up because people experience hypnosis in different ways. It can be resistant, and you're you in the moment, and you're watching yourself cautiously at a distance, or you could be like me and be that person again completely. And it was, looking back on it, it was one of the most remarkable things I ever experienced. At about my late 20s, there I am being 14 years old again. And the upshot of that, David, was using language, recorded, words, phrases, that I hadn't used in decades. A decade and a half. Mind-blowing. And anyway, thinking like an adolescent as well. So I feel this pulsation, this feeling in my right forearm, and I'm on the ground. I lift it up and I see that, I skidded into the ground when I fell, and I scraped my forearm on the sidewalk, on the concrete. Now, adults don't think this way, and I don't think girls or women ever think this way. Well, and I take that back. It's a boy kind of thing, generally speaking. I looked at this, reddened area where I had torn off some skin and thought, wow, what a scab that's going to make. Like a boy's red badge of courage. Look at that baby.
Yeah. I
again,
this is in my time as well.
Exactly. So I then look around. My sister's not there. And I should also stress here, anybody that's grown up or lived in a small village knows that experience. Certain day, it's just you. There are no kids out playing. Nobody's driving by. No ice cream truck. No the old-fashioned knife sharpener's truck. This is a whole nother era. You're just you. And I kind of got up, brushed myself off. My intuition was my sister was in the house somewhere, and I had no idea how much time passed. I still don't. And I walked upstairs. My 2 sisters shared a bedroom at the top of the stairs. And I looked in, and I immediately saw Helen in the room with her back to me, looking out into the backyard. And I thought, okay, she's there. Private moment, fine. And I walk back downstairs. All of this is so clear in my mind. And I go to through the living room, through the dining room, and then stand looking into the kitchen. And there's my mom at the stove in right profile. I think she's making grilled cheese sandwiches for us. I do remember the exact words that I said, though. It was, Mom, Helen and I just saw some things in the sky over the Parker's house that looked like flying saucers from the movies. End quote. I'm sure of that. And my mom turned and looked at me with a serious look, and it extended for some moments, and just regarded me, so to say, like you look at another person seriously. And my thought was, this is the way grown-ups look at each other. And she didn't say anything. At a certain point, it's kind of a slight nod, and went back to what she was doing at the stove. This doubly sticks in my mind because it was either with Bud or Pete in regression. There was also a third hypnotist earlier who was actually a friend of mine who had basically taken a course in hypnosis and had no sense of or interest really in UFOs, but kind of tried out his technique on me. I don't remember how under I was, but with Bud and Pete, it was very profound. And it was either one of them at that moment who said, do you know what time it is? And I said, no. They said, is there a clock in the kitchen? I said, yes. They said, where is the clock? I said, on the far wall, kind of above and to the right of where my mom is standing. Look at the clock. Okay. What time is it? 20 of noon. It's just the way it is. Later, we had our lunch. Helen and I completely silent about this. Right after lunch, I got on my bicycle and I made my way to our village library, where I was a regular. I love libraries, still do. And at the time in the States, maybe in the UK as well, most American libraries in big cities and small towns had all the books on UFOs. The stigma was not yet there for libraries. In the 70s, it kind of caught up with them. And a lot of us that started collecting books early picked up some amazing books at library sales.
Yeah.
It was considered embarrassing to have flying saucer books in your collection if you were a serious library. And for the first and last time in my life, I took out 2 books on UFOs, flying saucers. I say that because from then on, I just started to buy them. I didn't take them out of libraries and built my own library. I just saw the terms on the spine, took a quick look at the cover, took them out, brought them home, went up to my room, closed the door, flipped through them, and much to my disappointment, horror on a certain level, they were both exactly the opposite kind of books of what I wanted. I was looking for something, some grown-up text that would explain this away. Tell me what I had seen was some, anomaly, some nonsensical, I had misinterpreted, and they were both, My Trip to Mars, My Trip to Venus kind of books.
Yeah.
One of them, I'll never recall the exact title. The other I will always recall because the cover was so iconic, and it is a true classic of UFO literature. It's I'm blanking for a moment. George Adamski.
George Adamski. I was going to say, I bet it was George Adamski, wasn't it?
Flying Saucers Have Landed, which was co-authored by Desmond Leslie. Not a name that jumps out for most people interested in UFOs, but Leslie went on to become a very respected science writer. And of course, Adamski went on to was already considered the leading figure in the contactee movement. Anyway, I would have taken them right back to the library if it wasn't already fairly late in the day. They did go back the next day, and that was that. Now, late that afternoon, early that evening, my sister came up to me and said, do you want to talk about this? What we saw. And I looked at her and I said one-syllable word, which was no. Well, how do we repress memories? How does it happen? I don't know. I'm a layperson that studied psychology where I've needed to and have made many acquaintances and friends over the years who are mental health professionals. Although it's not well known in America. It's hardly a blip on the map. In the UK and what we used to call Commonwealth countries, the Samaritans International is a highly respected, wonderful organization.
It is, yeah.
And I'm very proud to say that I was a Samaritan at their busiest office in America for most of 8 years. I say most of because I had to take some very necessary breaks. It can be rough work. For 4 years, I was simply a well-trained lay on-phone volunteer, and for the next 4 years, I did that and was also a shift supervisor. Always very proud of that and learned a lot about how to function in higher stress and help people who were stressed, primarily by being a good listener. Anyway, don't mean to go off on a tangent, except to say most of us that are lucky enough to have had relatively happy, healthy lives with normal, neurotic, loving families, but, minimal trauma growing up, our hearts go out to, and we can only try to imagine what it would be like to deal with sexual abuse as a young person or something. Not a day passes that, unfortunately, in our culture and news, whether it's just some terrible person or this continuing terrible church scandal, nature can be kind and allow you to deaden, repress, block those memories. They come back, they don't come back. And I don't know exactly my mechanism, but within a matter of weeks, I had talked myself out of it because I couldn't deal with it. I didn't want to deal with it. And over the next few years, I started to become more social. I developed my talents I wanted to be an artist very much, and that was my career track from the time I had been a kid. I loved to sing and was a member of all of my high school singing groups and president of our high school chorus and was in all the school plays and loved theater and all this stuff, and moved into a world of having the luxury of go to art school and dream about that. And about 14 years passed, and I can say only once in that time did the memory of that day come back. And I mark myself as a person of a certain era. I very much came of age in the 60s. And before LSD was made illegal in this country more than 50 years ago, I had tried it and had a wonderful, life-changing experience and several others after that. But it was on that very first LSD experience that some of these memories came back in an abstracted way. I did some paintings and drawings, which some years later I came upon and thought, ooh, that's uncomfortable. And I destroyed them. Interesting. And then started to follow my dream. I graduated from what I consider the finest art school in America. I traveled, came back, was hired by the school, taught painting in their Department of Continuing Education for years, started to show my work at small galleries in New York, started to meet famous artists. I know this is a very long answer to your very short question of how did I get involved. But then came an afternoon, David, where the memory returned. And it returned with a vengeance. And I can take time and tell you why I think it did. There were several factors. But the fact was it did. It bowled me over. Within 15 or 20 minutes, I was in tears. I thought I must be going insane because logic dictated to me, how could anyone forget an experience like that? It seemed impossible to me, and it troubled me tremendously, and I had to really calm myself down. And I'm in my little commercial loft down in New York's Chinatown, where I lived and worked, and I thought the whole thing out and thought, what do I do now? This is just totally taken me over, and I'm seeing everything in my mind as clear as if it had just happened. And I thought, there's only one thing to do. I have a witness, my sister. While I was following the dream of being a painter, Helen lived about a mile or so north of me in that part of New York City called the East Village. She was very much a bohemian, I guess you could say, as I was. At the time, her focus was on her poetry. Besides graduating with a degree in English literature from an experimental college out on Long Island, she also was a graduate of the French Fashion Institute in New York City. And at that time, this is the mid-'70s, the whole punk music scene is just starting to begin to make its presence known and literally explode into popular culture within months. And Helen was, her boyfriend at the time, still one of my dearest friends, a great musician named Albert Bouchard, who is the original drummer for the great heavy metal group, the Blue Oyster Cult.
Yep.
And Albert suggested that he take some of her poetry and put it to music, which this is just the following year, see if the guys liked it, went on an album went gold, album went platinum, Helen became a singer-songwriter, and the rest is history. But at that moment, she was poor as a church mouse, living in a 150-year-old tenement walk-up, 5th floor. And I called her, and I said, "Are you busy? Is this a good time to talk?" "No, everything good." I said, "I have a situation here, and I need your help. I have remembered something that happened when we were kids, and I need to know if you remember the same thing or something different or not at all." And I thought this out enough that I've realized if I just tell you what I remember, you'll say yes or no, or some variation on that, but I'll really never know in my heart if indeed you remember what I remember. She said, "I understand." I said, "So let me set the scene." And David, I started to describe the weather, where we were standing on the front lawn of our house, how close we were to each other in proximity to one of my mother's little gardens, and she stopped me mid-sentence and laughing said, "Stop, I know what you're talking about." And I said, "Okay, what?" And she proceeded to tell me essentially what I've told you, with very little variation. What was different was she wasn't sure whether it was 5 or 6 of these things that we saw, which shortly after we got off the phone on that first conversation, I sat down. I'm a working artist in New York, living in my studio, and did my very first work of art involving UFOs. It was an oil painting on paper of 6 of them, so that I could show it to her and cover the one at the lower right with my hand and say, "Was it this or this?" I still have that painting. And after she told me what she remembered, I had a moment of split, I can only say, elation and anxiety. It was essentially a moment of, "Oh my God, they're real. Oh my God, it was real." And then she said something that, if that hadn't been enough, completely changed my life forever, totally blew me off my career track, which I still harbor a certain amount of resentment toward, but that was the way it was. And I said, "But there's more," and words to the effect of, "I'm not sure how you're going to feel about this." This is, again, 1975, and the only references to abduction, UFO abduction, in popular culture, even in organized UFO studies, were confined to the Betty and Barney Hill case, a few other lesser-known allegations. There were 1 or 2 books that, the Hill case happened in 61, which I think we both felt was the year that this happened to us, but it didn't become public till 65. And, one could argue that in those intervening 14 years for me, I had heard things that I hadn't paid attention to, but she started to describe her experience of that afternoon, and it blew my mind, quite simply. I should stress here that my sister and I were not just siblings. We were extremely close friends. Had been, there's always that goofy rough patch at a certain point growing up. But we were devoted to each other. We were both artists. We were both writers. We both like watching, bad movies and smoking a lot of pot. We both excelled in our various fields. We had a lot of friends in common. We were there for each other all through our lives, emotionally, financially, whoever was doing better than one. And we didn't lie to each other. We were very close friends. And out of, nowhere in a sense, she starts talking about, she remembered that moment where I kind of peeled off to the right and disappeared from her peripheral vision. And she said, I knew you were running into the house to tell Mom. What else could it be? She said, but as far as I was concerned, this was the most fascinating thing I had ever seen. I wasn't scared or anxious, which many years later, a marvelous mental health professional who I had gone into therapy with, in great part to reconcile this split in my reality at that point of this obsession with this subject and not being able to talk about it or whatever, as well as a very favorite professor at New York University of mine, explained to me that part of the difference between Helen and I and our experience of that day was my anxiety was informed by wanting to be accepted and wanting to be one of the cool kids and wanting to have nicer clothing and have a girlfriend. Helen was still, one step away from imaginary friends and childhood, true childhood reality. And for her, it was just wondrous, magical. And she said, all these years that have passed, I've reflected on this, often several times a week. It's always just, right there. I said, what have you thought about it all these years when you think about it? She said basically that it was the most amazing thing I ever saw and that it made me feel special. But I remember as you peeled away, I saw something that even as a kid I knew wasn't possible, but I remember it. And what was that? She said a blue beam of light shooting out of the bottom of one of these things. And I turned, in a matter of seconds, I turned to see you in that beam of light. I know you can't see like a flashlight beam during the day. You can see the spot on the wall, but it's only like at night in the fog where you can see that line, It's not an uncommon phenomenon in the UK where fog occasionally happens. Yeah. And if you shine light at night, you can see that line because the light is catching on billions of micro droplets of water. She said, however, that's what I saw. Then the light went off, you went down, and I went up. I said, pardon? She said, I simply lifted off the ground. No fear, no anxiety. It was just amazingly cool. And I started to rise. Her hair was fairly long at the time. She described what it felt like blowing in the wind, looking down, seeing the top of our house for the only time in her life, seeing me getting smaller, and then looking up and seeing herself get closer and closer to the bottom of one of these things. My mind is already going, oh my God, my sister's insane. Not a liar, but insane, because this couldn't be, except that I had to catch myself and say, 1.5 seconds ago, it was perfectly okay that you saw 5 flying saucers over the neighbor's house with little windows on them. Keep listening. And then she described something that I have in my work in ufology as a investigative writer, but primarily conditioned over the many years that I worked as Bud Hopkins' assistant, descriptions in sort of flashes that I have now heard maybe several hundred times, even from people around the world, even using some of the same words and phrases. Helen remembered at a certain point early on being walked through a metal hall, kind of curved, with a bunch of little beings that, this is years before the term gray comes into the lexicon in ufology or even popular culture. Now, many people who are not, involved in this subject know what a gray is. It's not just a shade between black and white. And she said, little doctors with big heads and big black eyes that spoke to me in my head, and one very large one. And then she remembered being on the metal table, no clothes on, 12 years old, with all of these little beings leaning over her and the big one, and hearing in her head very clearly in English the following. We have seen you before. We will see you again. We will not hurt you. You are special. We love you. I have heard these same things, and some of your listeners have heard them also, and directly, not from somebody else, for many years. And for my sister, part of the complexity of the experience and looking back on it was that at a certain point and she felt it was the big one that was communicating, that she felt, when the words, we will not hurt you, appeared in her head, she was experiencing pain. And that was not okay with her. She was not fond of them and did not think this was a transcendently wonderful experience, was not pleased that it had been done without her permission. And then the next thing she remembered, she's back on the ground, and I'm still passed out. And she said, I knew you were going to be okay. I leaned down. I could see you were starting to move. I knew that you were going to be waking up in a matter of a minute or two. So I just stepped around you and went upstairs to think about this in my bedroom. I took all this in. And as much as I resisted it, I knew there was something to it. My first question for her upon her completing her account was, how come all these years that you've never forgotten this, we never spoke about it? She said, very simple. That afternoon, I went up to you and I said, do you want to talk about this? And you said no in a way that I understood that this was troubling, problematic, upsetting to you, and I respected that. And you're my brother. I love you. I respect you. And one day led to the next week, led to the next month, led to the next year. And that's why we never talked about it. And I came away from that afternoon, David, not at all happy about this exchange. I like my life the way it was. I was one of those few people who was following a real dream from childhood. I was a painter. I was a sculptor. I was starting to show my work. I was living in a great little industrial loft downtown, a total outsider. I had met Roy Lichtenstein. I had spoken with Andy Warhol. I had apprenticed with two famous painters. I was going somewhere. My work was good. It was getting better. And all of a sudden, this railway train had hit me. And I continued to teach painting. I continued to paint and do my work. But I will tell you, I mean, this is not like someplace else. I'm a New Yorker. I was born there. I grew up in those museums. I was studying with some of the people whose work was in the Museum of Modern Art. And I could see myself into the future, that I was going to be well known, that I was going to be a respected American artist, that my work was going to be in museums around the world and collections and sold for good money, and I was going to earn my living doing this and live a very interesting life. And all of a sudden, I was faking it. The heart had been torn out of it. It wasn't my primary passion anymore, and I did not like it at all. I continued again to work for some years, and then it kind of faded out. I'm beginning to start again, interestingly. and start again, ironically, where I left off many years ago. It's not a priority right now, but I need to do it and want to do it. And that is how I got involved.
Yeah. So it seems to that seems to suggest why you felt so bad about the way things went, fairly recently. The disappointments that in the way things went obviously must have hit you pretty hard, I would have thought. We weren't going to go too far into that, but you know where I'm going with that.
Yeah, well, you're right.
I can imagine that must have hit you like a freight train, really.
It did. The fact is that over the years, it was kind of its own internal drive mechanism. For years, it was textbook definition of obsession. I couldn't stop reading about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop looking into it on my own. I was reticent to link up with other people at first because I still bought the original myth that, yes, this was real. This had happened to my sister. This was something that we had shared the early part of that experience and had this extraordinary sighting together, that this was not being talked about, that it was wrong, that our government, which obviously knew something, wasn't telling us about it. I became a real activist. But again, I figured other, what we'll laughingly call grown-ups, that took it as seriously as I did were probably nuts. So why would I want to meet up with them? But over the first year or two, I was very fortunate to connect with 3 individuals who went on to become my mentors. Best known was Bud. And then, of course, make acquaintances in the research community. And then all of a sudden I'm there and I'm doing it. And then later on, that whole first generation of people that I started with, a lot of them are gone now. And I'm articulate. I'm a pretty good presenter of information. I see myself as an educator. This is something that I should be doing. The degree to which I want to do it aside, I see it as a responsibility. The payoffs for me were and remain primarily the people that I have met over the intervening decades, many of them the dearest people in my life, among my closest friends, even some that I think of as family, who I would have never met otherwise. Then the other aspect is as somebody who learned early on, developed early on a passion for traveling and seeing some of the world. And before I even got involved in this, I had, I'm sure, visited 20 countries already on a shoestring budget, but I've occasionally gotten to travel to places that I would not have visited otherwise. Most notably, not that I would have never gone to the UK, I had already visited the UK when I got involved in researching the Rendlesham case, but it brought me back there many times, and many friendships came out of that, and learning about this extraordinary, country that you live in, kingdom. It has been, a plus for me. But overall, would I have chosen this direction in life if everything had been completely objective? I don't think so, but, it's all speculation, for goodness sakes.
I think the subject actually chooses you, doesn't it, in the end?
That's people are so philosophic about that. Everything is predestined, or you're completely a free agent and it's all free choice, or it's something in between. I'm damned if I know. I remember years after the fact, my mother and I sitting and having a drink together, and her reflecting back on this extraordinary change in direction for myself, and to a degree my sister as well, that had we been playing in the backyard that day rather than the front yard, how different our lives would have turned out. And I remember thinking in that moment, yeah, you're probably right, Mom, and then thinking, Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, if it was up in there, it could have been to any garden, couldn't it?
Exactly.
Something that sort of cropped into my mind. Was there any suggestion that Helen could have had an implant fitted, or was there any marks or things?
My sister, she did, and it was in a location that many implant cases have been documented. Serious study of this fascinating, creepy, complex, troubling area of UFO studies, that there are these artificial little things that are inserted into various parts of the bodies of experiencers while they are, taken, that leave no scarification. And the ones that I have seen primarily or through the late great Dr. Roger Lear, an American podiatric surgeon who had tremendous courage and who, before he died some years ago, was asked by a great number of people to remove ones that had either been picked up in x-rays or CAT scans, or that they were aware of, or they could feel just under the surface of their skin, this kind of thing. And we can speculate, because it's not like they're, an old pocket watch with lots of moving parts or something. They're decidedly digital, I guess is the only word I can use. In appearance, the ones that I've been aware of have broken down into two general areas, looking more or less like a grain of rice or a BB. And my sister Helen suffered from allergies, hay fever, would have times where she would sneeze a lot as a kid and as a grown-up. And remember, part of our family history was something that happened, I don't know, probably a year before that, maybe a year after, 6 months on either side, I don't know, and there's no way to confirm it. But it never happened before, and it never happened after that. My sisters were sleeping in their bedroom, my parents in theirs, me in mine. And at a certain point, I'm woken up because there's a light turned on in the hallway where normally there would never be. And, like a kid, rub your eyes, get out of bed. The action is in my sister's room. Anne is fast asleep, but the light is on, and my folks are there with Helen, who is looking at me when I walk in. And I think my mom is sitting next to her, and my eyes immediately go to a pillowcase, and a number of inches of it are bright red. You do not forget that. Next was, either my mom or dad made the phone call. My mother had, I think it was a second cousin who was what in the medical world an ear, nose, and throat guy. That was his specialty. And his practice was a few towns over in a town on Long Island, New York, called Garden City. And the next thing I knew, my sister was bundled up and in the car, and Mom drove her there. This is still, it's dark. She woke him up in the middle of the night. And then, around breakfast time back she came, and we had a little talk. And she said he, those devices that you can look into the ears or the nose with, and he had examined her nose. The blood was the result of a nosebleed that was bad enough that I guess she woke up my parents. And she said, well, what had happened was she woke up in the middle of the night. She always had a box of tissues by her bed. I didn't, but that was, part of what she needed. And she said, I just started to sneeze. And I turned on the little light by my bed, and I'm sneezing. And at a certain point, I really sneeze hard, and I look in the tissue. And here's this little icky thing. it looks like a BB, except its surface, it looked a little like a pearl. It had mucus on it, and it was just kind of ick. And I threw it in the waste paper basket, of course. This was years and years before, again, any of this made sense or I'd even heard the term implant. But, yes, she had one, and she sneezed it out. In the very famous so-called Linda case, the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abductions, that Bud Hopkins wrote up in one of the most compelling, complex, challenging, brilliant UFO investigations ever, called Witnessed, the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abductions. I know it's published in the UK as well as here. Linda had a really incredible looking, I've never seen one like it. It really had all the bells and whistles. Implant also well up in her nasal cavity. And, she knew it was there. She could, there's a slight sensation to it. And she had a cousin who was an X-ray technician, X-ray it. Her cousin didn't believe in any of this stuff, X-rayed it, and there it is. Unfortunately, the reproduction in Witnessed is not very good. I wish that we had access to that original X-ray. It's deep in the archive, I guess. But the thing that troubled Helen the most was, she said, after the doctor looked in her nose, he said, "Did you ever stick a pencil up into your nose?" My sister said no. And he said, "Well, you must have, even though it's way, way up. But that's the only thing that could have caused, that I can think of, that could have." And she was quite insulted. I mean, she's 12 years old. He was calling her a liar in so many words because in his experience and, his way of seeing the world, that's all that he could imagine or visualize or know as a physician. But yes, she did have one. And I have been aware of other cases where other people have had the same reaction in a sneezing fit. If it's located there, and it is one location we've documented multiple cases, blown out like the same way.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate it ended up in the waste bin, wasn't it, really?
And haven't thought of that, didn't we think of that in the intervening years since?
Of course, no, I know. That's the way.
I should also say that after I met Bud Hopkins, which was 5 years before he published his first UFO book, a very important one, Missing Time, which not only was one of the best, maybe the best, early book on the abduction phenomena, looking at it scientifically, but gave the English language a new phrase, missing time. And even in popular culture, many people, once again, who, would not have thought of gray as anything other than a shade between black and white, know that phrase missing time, allegedly, has to do with UFO and paranormal experience and is not a generic phrase free of that association.
Yeah. Well, I can see what drove you into the field anyway. I
had to know what happened to my sister. I had to know, and drove me on for years and years. At a certain point, the obsession aspect dissipated, and I was somebody who was called a ufologist, who also happened to be a theater manager, a photographer, a journeyman carpenter, other things as well. But that's what I did. And at a certain point, you kind of stick your head up and you look around, say, wow, like it or not, enjoy it or not, you're now one of those people who people listen to on the radio or read their work or see, on a documentary or for 15 seconds on a television show or what have you. Enjoy it for what it is, but don't get it out of proportion. I have a real problem with prima donnas and people who, it's like one step away from the entertainment business, and they impose what they may well believe, long for, fear, think as empirical fact, when in fact it is not. And what I know after more than 40 years in this field, what I am completely sure of is how little I actually really know. Truly, I know we're not alone. I deduce that we are most likely dealing with a myriad of other intelligences. It's not one group. We're all familiar with all of the places and descriptions of where they are supposed to be from. You've got your Alpha Centaurians and your Nordics and your Reptilians and these ones and that ones. Yeah, I don't know that for a fact.
No.
I also know that in my years as a Samaritan, and one of the things that we were trained to understand, and it is a wonderful lay training, and I encourage anybody who is looking for a situation to do some public service in their community to consider training and becoming a Samaritan, even for a year, which is the normal time people move on. Yeah. But the physiology of human shock cannot be underestimated. And many of my colleagues, many of whom I respect and admire, don't pay that much attention to it. For me, you're looking at something that challenges everything you know, and there are a series of things that simply happen. Auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, dumps of adrenaline and epinephrine into the blood, either a focused sense of denial or what we call screen memory, both of which are very real, that there's no question that some of them have the power or the technology to shape our perceptions, to look at X but see Y, if you get my meaning.
Yeah.
And for me, it may not be that, or it may not completely be that, because it's informed by my looking into the eyes of, let's say, a gray alien, and there is something deep in my mind says, oh, no, you don't. I'm not, this isn't happening. This is not happening. I am seeing a 3.5 foot tall white owl. That's what I'm seeing. And nobody's going to ever convince me of anything other. That's strange enough. Or that is the image that they are planting in our mind. But nobody, for me, can empirically state without, hesitation that it's X or Y, given the nature of the specific case.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, that's what I said. I was talking to Malcolm about that last week on the last show. There aren't really any experts in this field at all, aren't they? Well, it's true though, isn't it? I mean, there's people that know more about it and more about little bits and pieces, but nobody's a real expert.
That is for me. You've really hit on something important here, and thank you to our friend Malcolm for sparking this part of the conversation. I find myself wincing when I am within my own earshot described as an expert, because you're an expert in the unknown.
Yeah.
You know for sure about this subject that is completely rooted in the unsure. And we know there are people out there who are proud to be called experts and smile and nod when they are.
Yeah.
And I have a problem with many of them. I think many of them are well-meaning, but a lot of it goes back to the brilliance for me of at least the first 7 years of the 10-year run of that now immortal show, The X-Files. In the very first episode, the pilot, which any fans of the show I encourage to chase down online and rewatch, because as pilots go, it's brilliant. In that very first episode, we understand the dynamics of our lead two characters, the backstory, their motivations, etc. And we are introduced in that very first episode in Fox Mulder's little basement office to the poster with the words that inform so much of what overrides everything I want to believe. Yeah. In this case, I want to believe they're real. I want to believe they're not real. I want to believe that if they're real, they're good. And because I really want to believe that so much, I'm going to just, that's the truth. That's the truth. And that's what, I met another person who totally believes so much that they're all good, that validates me. Wait a minute, I'm part of a community now of people who follow that philosophy that they're all good. And if a person has a bad experience, that's a military abduction that's done by, human beings to screw around with the reputation of the aliens, another word that I'm never comfortable using. I fall back on other intelligences more often than not, because they're all good and they're just here to help humanity, but the bad human, how can you know that for a fact? You can't. And there's a quotation that is credited to Field Marshal Goering, who is the Minister of Culture for the Third Reich, that as an American Jew who lost relatives during the Holocaust and knows the story of it, I'm not a fan of Hermann Goering. However, I love this quote, and I've transposed it for my own use, which is translated as well from the German as possible. When I hear the word culture, I reach for my pistol. For me, when I hear, about the photograph of an alien looking through the window, or that all aliens are good, or that there are 56 different races visiting us, I reach for my allegorical pistol, because you can't know that. That means that you are wrong, but you're putting it forward as true. The difference is this. If I am one of those people and I say, I really believe that, or I'm personally convinced that, or my own individual research leads me to conclude that, blah, 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 as opposed to this is the truth, is all the difference in the world.
Absolutely.
And I will get in those people's faces whenever it comes at me. I'm sorry, I cannot tolerate. And it's also one of the things that, in a secondary kind of way, gives our field of study the loopy reputation, or informs that caricature of flying saucers and little green men, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that popular culture, to a degree, still likes to hold on to, because if that's true, that it's nonsense and it's all explainable in other terms, then I can rest easy on a quiet anxiety that I sometimes reflect on. What if we're not alone? And what if, they're a lot more advanced than us? And what if,
Yeah. I mean, hence the reason all the books were removed from those libraries. It's the reason, is it? Because of the...
part of it. I think there was also and I say this again as somebody who not just is an avid reader from childhood, who is not just a book lover and a collector of books, a true bibliophile, but worked in libraries growing up in high school, our town library, and when I was in art school, our art school library, who speaks at libraries whenever I can. I accepted an invitation, in fact, just this week, for this summer for a small library in another part of New York State that I'm already looking forward to. That I think it was more an intellectual peer pressure within the world of library scientists. Even in the smallest town, you can bet that your local librarian is one of the best read, most open-minded, most interested in the world people, even if they never left that little town. These are active intellects. These are people worthy of cultivating as friends, people who think big thoughts, and who have the power to change young people's minds, and often do. But I don't think I think it was more a push to a good library shouldn't have books on this stuff that we all know is so controversial and so problematic and so steeped in mystical thinking. In fact, that really is one of the saddest commentaries for me, that if enough people fall in line behind a certain belief that they help to make popular, all aliens are good. And you look around and there's a community of people, of thousands and thousands of people that subscribe to this philosophy and draw strength from the fact that they're part of a network of people that they know are convinced of the same thing. You have something that is functionally identical to the basis of a conventional religion. I believe, I have ultimate faith in, therefore it must be. And the reinforcement is everybody else who feels the same. Look at any of the world's great religions where, one can say, oh, well, there's this miracle that I know confirms the fact that God, as I envision God, is real. But for somebody who is an agnostic or scientifically inclined or simply draws their strength and inspiration from love and family and community service, but is not mystically inclined, or a deist who accepts the idea of that divine spark that set everything into motion, but once it was so done, that God per se is not a micromanager and stuff happens, and it's not God's will. I'm off on another tangent here, but it's a pet one of mine, that belief in itself, even supported by the belief of a lot of other people that feel the same way, in no way should be confused with empirical fact.
It's important, Peter, because this is your show, by the way, not mine. So you can take it anywhere you want. I mean, is there some sort of a drive or mechanism that keeps you motivated in your research and investigations, or?
Wow, good question. Well, for the first decade or two, it was in great part, what the heck happened to my sister? And what the heck did we really see, and what does it represent, and what are the implications for humanity? I would say that over the past few years, given the nature of the scandal, rooted in the fact that my co-author on the best-known book I've been involved in, I've written several others, has basically been proven and reproven to have not told the truth about his account, to be a professional forger going back some decades, to a number of things, as we know, that could be presented in a court of law and shown that it conflicts with, 10 other things that he said or wrote at different times. And my original resistance to it. And then a period of time of beginning to acknowledge the many independent pieces of research coming at me, and starting to read them and realizing 30 years ago I didn't dig as deep as I should have. 30 years ago plus, when I started on the project that resulted in the book Left at East Gate, I wanted to believe, and I had no real reason to believe or assume that somebody was already involved in perpetrating a fraud and looking, ideally, for me, somebody just like me, who would take them in good faith, who, when they looked in their eyes and got lied to, would not assume they had been lied to, because that wasn't their experience or attitude or character. And then a period of sadness, depression, anger, humiliation. Then a period of a year and a half of quietly and loudly, in person and in writing and via radio shows, apologizing to what amounted to thousands of people who, because I had done such a good job of selling this story, and the individual believed it. And the complexity of the web of where truths butt up against lies, what I'm saying here is that the whole process has left me less than, happy to get up every morning and do UFO research. I've been burned on a certain level, and 95% plus of the feedback, the responses of the communications that I've received over these past several years regarding this have not just been positive and supportive, but genuinely moving. In fact, the upside of the downside of this period in my life has been how moved I've been by how many people out there absolutely get what happened, and who understand to a degree what I've been through. So where does that be right now? Based on your question, what keeps me motivated now? I feel a sense of responsibility to continue to do what I think I do best in this work, which is to act as an educator where and when I can. For me, I have to categorize, the whole Rendlesham UFO story is still very real, very viable, very important, and nobody should misconstrue my experience with my co-author and the secondary spin-off of how that muddied the water so tremendously and left a lot of people infuriated with each other, because the one thing he still does well is mislead people. That I got to a point where I realized after more than a quarter of a century of a primary interest in this particular case, of the ramifications of, the details surrounding, the latest developments about this series of events that took place in late December over 3 nights in the UK, in Suffolk, that I don't care anymore. I'm burned out on it. Yeah. I care that the work goes on. And I'm not talking about UFO studies in general and their implications for humanity, which continue to drive me forward because it's terribly important stuff. But I've kind of made it very clear to all the players that I'm not participating in it anymore. I wish them all well. I will, if there are new breakthroughs, I'll regard them with interest. I will return to Suffolk, UK and the Rendlesham Forest whenever I can, because it's a fascinating part of England, because some of the dearest people I know live there, because it's part of my life, but my private life in a certain way. And at the same time, I've withdrawn from the field, so to say, on that.
I understand exactly. I hope you do come back sometime, because obviously I live near there as well. So I hope you consider me one of those friends.
I will, and I'll tell you right now, and just say to my other friends in the UK, the past 3 years, as my late father's health had gotten more fragile, I have canceled plans to return to the UK. It's the longest period in time that I haven't been back to the United Kingdom in 30 years. And it's a second home to me, and I miss visiting. And I, even if it's at the end of the year, somewhere along the line, I'll figure out the wherewithal and put together some financing, and I'll be back sometime this year. I don't know where all I'll be other than the South and London and Suffolk. If I can get out and about more than that, I will. But I'll see you before the end of the year as far as that goes, David, and all my other friends in, the Suffolk, Norfolk, London zone there down in that part of England. But where this left me was contemplating, where do I go from here? And the very natural suggestion came right back. You go back to all the other stuff that you were doing and continued to do throughout your research and investigation and in the years following. While some of your listeners may only associate me with Rendlesham and that story and that book, I have deeply investigated, I'm sure, 24 different, very dissonant areas of UFO studies, many of them rooted in post-war history, all of them which have generated articles and conference papers and lectures and talks and interviews. And this year, I'm not kind of back to where I was several years ago in terms of invitations to speak here, there, and the next place, but I'm very pleased with the ones that I'm getting. Yes. And already got half a dozen lectures coming up in the first half of this year on decidedly different subjects, none of them having to do with the RFI, which is fine with me, and am continuing to develop papers, investigations, and research projects that are purely self-assigned. I am self-employed, have been for about 15 years, which also means self-unemployed, depending on the time when it is. I'm not doing well financially, but I chose this route, and it's my life, and I think the main thing that's driving me forward in ufology at this point is no longer an obsession, no longer caught up in what happened to my sister. I know what happened to her and understand it as well as I can, but quietly being there to be accessible to people who are where I was 20 or 30 years ago. And, I'm an unpaid consultant to a lot of folks who I really admire, who are that next generation here and in the UK, people who we know and people that you don't know, who will be the names of the future and are already making their mark with their first or second book, talks that they're starting to do, who only dreamt of doing it a few years ago. 30 years ago for me it was, oh my God, I wonder if Stanton Friedman or Timothy Good would ever give me the time of day. Yeah. And, thinking about how kind they and so many other people whose names are now legend in the field and were even then, to spend time with a nudnik nobody like me, although even then I had a special cachet. I was Bud Hopkins' assistant, and that got me in doors that didn't, other people weren't able to pursue. And in fact, right now I'm working on a talk that I've never given before. It's a talk nobody's ever given, in fact, that I'll be doing for the first time late next month at a major conference that is the first of its kind, although it is very much modeled after the original International UFO Congress, which still continues on under very able guidance in the Phoenix area every year. It has been in February, but this year it's switching over to September. The original one ran for some years in a small gambling town in a very remote corner of Nevada, on the, I think, Arizona-Colorado border. I'd have to check, but I think it touches on 2 other states in that area. And the thing that made the original International UFO Congress, now rechristened in this new incarnation as the UFO MegaCon, it's going to be 7 full days and 8 nights. It's not going to be 6 speakers. It's going to be a couple of dozen speakers. It's not going to draw 100 or 200 people. It might have 800 or 1,000 or more. And it was a trip to do. People like me, the speakers that were brought in, you give your talk. You're on a panel discussion. If you have products to sell, you're doing that. But the rest of the time, you're basically available to anybody that wants to ask you questions, hang out with you, speak with you, see old friends and colleagues, people that you've gotten to know over the years, in my case, decades, who come to these conferences. And I encourage anyone who is interested in a remarkable experience, who is able to take the time and get the money together. It's very good value for what it is, to chase down online the UFO MegaCon and check it out. And join us if you possibly can. But the talk is going to be on Bud Hopkins' work with children. This is very delicate territory, and one can immediately appreciate that, if you were somebody who was in Hopkins' position, the best known and most respected UFO abduction researcher in the world, for one segment of the population, you were somebody worthy of tremendous respect and admiration. For a larger section of the population that just, stumbled on that there's this person who's a professional painter who, works with people who think they've been abducted by aliens, and in some cases has, worked with people always with the parents handy, close by, and as often as possible with mental health professionals. This person should be in jail. This is crazy, double crazy and dangerous. However, he did a remarkable job of it, and I was at his side in a number of cases. And what kind of sparked my going off on this tangent, rather than going back into abduction studies per se, as well as continuing to expand my work on America's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, who was murdered, an early casualty of the UFO cover-up, working on a research project involving cults and UFOs, which is a very troubling area. 20 years ago, I worked for a multimedia company in New York City that had optioned all of the lectures of a long defunct UFO conference. Now it was called the Omega Conference. It was held in a town called North Haven, Connecticut, and it ran for 10 years. And over those 10 years, everybody who was anybody in the work spoke there. And they ended up with a catalog of tapes that was the rights to were purchased by my boss. I oversaw 6 lectures being put on VHS tapes. That's how long ago it was. And one of them was a talk by Bud given in the early 90s on children, the youngest abductees. To the best of my knowledge, it was the only time he ever gave a public talk on that, of the hundreds of talks that he gave on that specific subject. And so several months ago, kind of just wanting to focus in on this, because it is important work and it had never been really aired in a public way. That tape didn't sell a lot. I met with my old employers who still held the copyright on that lecture, and said, we're on good terms. What would it take for me to acquire the rights to that tape so I can use excerpts of it in my talk? That might just be with your permission, but ideally to make it available to the public. There are people out there, especially researchers and experiencers, who might want to have access to it. And they incredibly generously simply gave me the rights. And so I immediately had it transposed to DVD, have been going through a lot of my notes and records from that time. And a very precious part of my research archive. And it went like this. Back in the day, over the years, I read thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of letters that came to Bud Hopkins. I don't know how many thousand, but when I say thousands, I mean over 2,000 over the course of 15 years on and off of our 35-year friendship. And Bud read them, of course, but he worked out a very simple methodology of symbols to put on the outside of envelopes when I'd hand them over to him. And this is all way not quite into the land of email or of the internet yet, they were letters, and they came from all over the country and all over the world. And Bud, being very old school, had, if he didn't respond to them, had me respond to almost every one with a simple note on our stationery and send it out. But through stars and asterisks and check marks, there were certain 4-star letters, so to say. You have to read this. This is important. This is terribly moving. This is a case you need to investigate. My suggestion, etc. And every once in a while, a letter would really touch me to a point where I'd think to myself, this is my life. This is my present life. I'm very privileged to be doing this. I know at some point in the future, probably long after we're gone, people will look back on people like us and say, good for them for not putting, financial security first, or, pioneering an area of study that we now take seriously, but back then a lot of people thought they were crackpots. And I'd bring a letter to them and say, is it okay with you if I use like little pieces of cut-out Post-its and cover up every salient detail to identify this person short of their handwriting, and just hold this in my files for maybe years in the future? The understanding was after you're gone, and perhaps draw on it in a way that I can't even know, because I'm not going to remember on this communication. And he was always very kind and knew that I would never be inappropriate with it, and thought, God, I haven't looked at that file for years. And I pulled it out and thought, I'm so glad I did this. Even though there is no way at all to trace this back to the individual, I still have to consider that there is a person out there who, this represents some of their most intimate thoughts. Should I use it? How can I use it? What, if I do, what part? And so I will draw a little bit from those communications as well. For me, it all goes back to my original excitement around research and investigation. I grew up professionally outside of the box. I'm an artist. My thinking is non-standard. I come at subjects in a non-traditional way. Being a painter, being a sculptor, living, more than a decade, eating, breathing, and going to sleep and waking up with the New York art world first in my mind, and how to distinguish myself as a creative person in an individual way. And people sometimes ask me, what do you suggest to a person? They're practical. They're not going to give up their day job maybe, but they want to do what you do. What would you suggest? And for me, it can be almost anything in a way. You can study science and physics and mathematics and psychology, or any of those separately, and it will assist you. You can be a Samaritan for a year or two, or work in any other area where you are doing your best to assist somebody in emotional trouble. Or you can study the arts and just learn to think in the abstract, and maybe come at something from an angle that a more technically minded person hasn't explored, even if they have a PhD in philosophy and science. I think one of the things that made Bud Hopkins a brilliant UFO investigator was that his mind was very independent. As a painter and a sculptor, it was all about, in a way, exploring the unknown. And considering that he grew up in a kind of provincial setting in Wheeling, West Virginia, but then went to a fine art department at Oberlin College, and then moved to New York in the late 50s, at a time when his dream was to become a late period abstract expressionist, and falling in with some of the great artists of the time and becoming a world-class intellectual, a voracious reader or student of ancient and modern history, certainly a great scholar on art history, a very, very active mind in the world of politics and human endeavors, somebody who is as much in love with the city of New York and its history and everything that made it the great microcosm of the entire world that it is at its best. Life experiences can be applied in so many different ways to becoming good at something in this area. But for me, the thrill of the hunt, for some people, they're not very good one-to-one with people. It's no reflection on their character. It's just not their strong point. For them, they may shine in the library or the archive or online searches, and putting the pieces together that way. Other people are brilliant presenters, and it's just a matter of pulling together information that they can then set the imaginations and the interests of other people alight by being a great, presenter at a conference or a talk at a local library, and start to train yourself that way, or do what you're doing, David, and go on the air. Years ago, this wasn't something that was really easy or accessible to most people, but now, through one of the best parts of our whole digital revolution, anybody can start their own podcast. You may reach 12 people or 12 million people. And as long as it's something that inspires you, that you get value out of, and that you begin to understand others do as well, there's your drive mechanism in moving forward, being an on-air broadcaster that you are now.
Well, funny thing is, you say that. At the beginning of the year, I had no idea this was going to happen.
Of course.
I was invited onto another show, and on the back of that, I was offered a position, of my own show. So where it's going to go from here, I don't know. But
one step at a time, one show at a time.
Yeah.
My dear, you remember Ket Vovolson from when you met her in Glasgow when we last saw each other. Ket now has her own radio show. I think of younger upcoming colleagues in the States. Ryan Sprague is now a great presence on the air.
I'd like to get Ryan on this show actually one day, maybe.
That should be easy enough to do. Right now, literally over this week or so, he is relocating from Los Angeles back to New York City. So it's a busy month for him. But all you need to do is contact him and just say, Peter and I discussed this on the air. Can you be a future guest? And my guess is he's going to say, sure, glad to.
I hope so, yeah. But, I just wanted to ask you I've got a few questions down here, and I'm not quite sure how much, so we've got about another 15 minutes or so.
I'll try to be more succinct with them.
No. I said, I suppose, what your thoughts on the disclosure movement? How do you feel this is progressing, both in the US and abroad? It seems to be every year we hear, this year's going to be the year of disclosure, and it's sort of, then we move into the next year and we're still doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, even before there was a quote-unquote disclosure movement, now I think the figure internationally associated primarily with it and a true leader in the work is Stephen Bassett, somebody who I have endless respect and admiration for. I don't know anybody more dedicated to getting the truth out there. Even before that, there were it would come in waves every few years, either triggered by serious media coverage of some case, popularity around some cultural phenomena, alleged leak of information, a famous person in the field suggesting this or that optimism would grow and then, move back into the realm of just business as usual again. One thing that does mark the disclosure movement worldwide is optimism, and that's great. You have people who have been inspired by other people to take part in it, One of the things that I admire and like and support about what we'll call the disclosure movement is that through the tireless work of people like Steve, there are now chapters of folks who have organized themselves probably in dozens of countries around the world. Now, what they do from, regional, local group to group is different. For many of them, it's simply a matter of keeping the subject in the public eye, of having somebody in the group give talks where possible, of publishing around it, etc. I'm an optimist, generally speaking, as I've moved through life, but I'm very circumspect about we the people, pushing the controllers of information to say, oh, you got me. Okay, we give up. Here's everything we know. I think the cover-up is so deeply ingrained into first world thinking. For some people, let's call it, deep state reality. My very best sense over the decades, observing it from a distance, observing it closer up, occasionally having access to individuals who are more deeply involved or may be more deeply involved in this than I will ever be, is that a struggle continues on the inside of various working groups embedded in various offices and agencies in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in countries in Russia, in Brazil, all over the place. Some countries, governments, simply have been more accepting and more forthcoming. Brazil is a good example. Yeah. Even going back more than 50 years, their leadership has been fairly outspoken. It's something that we don't get the impact of or realize the depth of in the UK or the US because the information is filtered through to us and never really emerges in the major media. And it's just, this is real. We're not alone. And our air forces have observed these things and been scrambled against them. And it is a genuine mystery, and we're not alone. In the United States, where the whole thing began, arguably, in the summer of 1947, and where the cover-up literally went into effect around President Truman, we have multiply layered problems, one of which is that the keepers of the secret are overwhelmingly still who they always were. Very powerful, inner circle, privileged white guys who communicate with others in their sequestered reality. And if it were even possible for a world leader to come forward on their own and just blurt it out, some people think it might happen. I've heard people say, yep, it's going to be the Chinese or it's going to be Putin. They're just going to do it and embarrass the United States and, the UK that they didn't do it. But for me, one of the real world problems is the cover-up may involve covering up how little we've learned over the decades, or how much we've learned that we feel will freak out the general public at large. Or let's just say that, 4 years ago it was President Obama, or tomorrow President Trump goes on the air and basically says, my fellow Americans and citizens of the world, it is my solemn duty to inform you that the United States government intelligence services have decided to acknowledge that we are not alone, that we've known about this since before 1947, and that we're not sure of the motives even yet, but we are now going to begin to air what we know and move forward, closer together as humanity, blah, blah, blah. If a president of the United States were to do that, there to be an immediate problem in terms of the American political reality of, well, wait a minute, that means that every other president before you is an unindicted co-conspirator and the biggest cover-up in human history. That doesn't look good for the Democrats or the Republicans, because they're just one big party, and it's about having power or not having power. And so that's a problem also for me. And this is something that I went nose to nose with about half a dozen years with during a panel discussion with Stephen Greer, who leads the notion for me that all aliens are good. How does he know it? He can't tell you. It would compromise his sources and might put you in trouble too. And it had to do with the nature of disclosure, that, power to the people, everything out, let's get it out now. We are entitled to know. Number one, the we who we're talking about represent a very small fraction of people who are alive on Earth right now. For some people in the field, especially those who live, eat, and breathe this stuff and have for years, who cares? Suck it up. You'll get used to it. You're going to lose sleep over the next couple of weeks, but we want to know. And, the thousands of us that represent the core of the disclosure movement, we're ready. Okay, but let's be a little considerate of our fellow human beings. Number two, how do you dig half a hole? If you disclose the basics, how do you not immediately say, oh, we also have this awkward situation of, not only are they coming and going and they land, they've got this technology, but there's a history that they take people. And, there's also this thing of hybrids where they've been mucking around with our DNA and their DNA, and there's all these beings that are part us, part them. Where are they? What are they up to? What are they about? Can't really say because we don't know. There's also this missing fetus thing where women get pregnant and then the pregnancy is simply missing in the later stages, in third trimester. They wake up one morning and they're not pregnant anymore. Oh, they didn't just have a spontaneous miscarriage and, it got lost. And, there's a lot of icky, weird stuff. And some of the hybrids, they can't walk down the street because they look too much like them. Other ones, they look enough like us that they are among us. In fact, one may be living across the hallway from you. That guy with the wispy hair and the pale gray eyes who doesn't talk too much, who isn't interested in sports, may mass panic. How do you deal with this? I don't know. The disclosure movement is healthy in that it gives those of us who want more and more people to know about it an outlet. I can tell you, as a former longtime off-Broadway theater manager, there is a certain dynamic that occurs in the theater. If you have the greatest comedy ever done and you have only a quarter of the seats filled, people will be self-conscious about laughing out loud. They need that communal sense. If it's not, a number, it's a critical dynamic. Once you hit that tipping point, people could care less, who says, geez, you have a funny laugh. You're just having a great time.
Yeah. It's a bit like being the first one to clap at something, isn't it?
That's correct, David. Just so. And so we are not near that point yet. But for every time that you do a broadcast and it reaches a new person, and I know this is just your second broadcast, but they're going to add up. Every time I give a talk at a library like I'll do this summer in Fallsburg, New York, and more people say, you know what? I do take this seriously. For me, the greatest stat is an abstract. Every year, and I can say this for a fact, more and more people care less and less what other people think about what they think about the subject. Yeah. That was not the case 10 years ago. That's good. But it's changing arithmetically, not geometrically. I remember an early conversation with Steve Bassett when he was just getting into this work. Almost a dozen years ago. saying, you're old enough to remember, all of the anti-Vietnam protests. That's what I want to do. I want to generate something like that, a groundswell that really affects the population, where it wasn't just guys like you protesting against the war and being drafted into a war that you knew was unjust and illegal and wrong and immoral. It was your parents as well, and then Walter Cronkite, the famous beloved American broadcaster, and then things changed. I said, I don't think it's going to happen like that, and here's why, and laid out my thoughts. But who knows? Maybe we will hit that critical mass. Maybe there will be some kind of WikiLeaks kind of leak of some information that's so undeniable that the general public will respond. I wish everyone in the disclosure movement well, but I don't think it in itself is going to change the picture. It will affect other things that can help to change it, though.
I do think, to a certain extent, disclosures kind of already happened because of all the release of all the UFO documents.
Well, that's a very good point, David. And by definition or philosophically, one could argue that the process is certainly in motion and has been, for decades, just among a smaller number of people. That pool of people grows every year. There's no question about that, and that is international. But it still has considerable way to go.
Yeah. I think a lot of it doesn't get released still. They're still holding stuff back. But of all the thousands of documents that they've released, you do find the odd treasure in there. And
you
but
do.
The trouble is you've got to dig for it. And it's like hiding a tree in a forest. You really
it's
need
true.
to.
And the other trouble with it is, okay, I get it. It's real. It's here. I've got access to it. I share this information. People are sharing it with me. This is amazing. How do you get the general public to acknowledge it and read it? It's how do you light that fire under them? And for me,
many still won't believe it, will they?
Well, if they hit that critical mass within themselves and hear a brilliant presentation or see a great documentary, the documentary Travis, the true story of Travis Walton, that I'm very proud of being an associate producer on, that I know you've seen, that is out there now more and more.
I've got a copy, it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's a brilliant documentary, period. But it happens to be a brilliant UFO documentary. It's one of the best for me to loan a copy or get a gift for your skeptical friend, because it's devastating. Yeah. It balances out the first-hand witness accounts with the science, with the FBI reports, with all of the supporting actual physical evidences, with the corroboration between all the sources, with the psychological evaluations. And it's very difficult to walk away from it untouched. If you were a total skeptic or denier, unless you really are that terrified in yourself that you'll say, I'm still not convinced. I'm sorry. Then you didn't really pay attention. But how do we get regular folks who's in their heart of hearts may say, of course, the odds are we're not alone. Just look at the statistics. And the number of millions of planets that even the most conservative astronomers now begrudgingly acknowledge have about the size of Earth, about the same size from a star, that's about the size of the sun, that have the basic building blocks to, depending on your point of view, if you are a person of faith, to create the miracle of life, courtesy of God, or the primordial ooze that produces the right chemistry for that first one-celled creature that a pragmatist or a scientist or an agnostic would argue, here's the beginning of the miracle of life, but I just see it in a different way. Yeah. What it'll take, maybe we'll find out in our lifetime and observe it ourselves. Here's hoping.
Indeed. I mean, there's got to be civilizations out there that are thousands of years in advance of us. So
or hundreds of thousands of millions.
Millions,
all over the speculation.
That's right.
Exactly.
And then that's before you start getting into the interdimensional argument of where people.
Thank you for mentioning. Very important. Part of this whole phenomena may not have to do with beings and civilizations out there, but right here, one or two dimensions away from us, living in the center of the earth, or again, one dimension away, that have always been part of the reality of where we are. Yeah. It's the mantra for me is there is a Zen mantra of defining a Zen beginner, knowing that you know nothing and having it be okay. You and I, David, know more than nothing, but it's okay that we know so little.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. We've got about 5 minutes left there, Peter. I saw you on Ancient Aliens a few weeks ago. Did you enjoy your stint on there?
I did. It was wacky, though. The way it worked was producer contacts you. They fly you out, in my case, from a regional airport mid-morning. I arrived in Los Angeles mid-afternoon, taken to my hotel, got together with 7 friends in the Los Angeles area, had a great dinner, then go over my notes. They had very strict instructions and protocols and things they wanted me to read, which I had for the weeks before, preparing answers. Then you're picked up, you're taken to the studio, and you're filmed for a couple of hours, and in my case, I ended up with 15 seconds visually and about 12 seconds voiceover. And I was home exactly 48 hours later and 6,000 miles later, a little tired, and none the worse for wear.
Wow. Yeah.
A lot of people, obviously, the main players, the people that they keep bringing back, they have been telling me, through one producer or another, that they wanted me to be on the show since 2010. And I joked with my producer that, well, they finally got me, and maybe next time I'll be on for a full minute.
Yeah,
here's hoping.
It doesn't surprise me to get you on there, because I mean you're a great orator and a great speaker, and I'm so pleased that you've agreed to come on this show. I really am.
It's been my pleasure.
So I appreciate Richard Dolan and everything, and you see him on there quite often. But I think you deserve a spot alongside him all the time. I know he's a good friend. He's a good friend of yours, isn't he?
He is.
He's actually another one I'd like to get on the show, but I know he's a very busy man, much the same as yourself. He's
Well, once you're up and running for a while, I'll see him in the next month or so, I'm sure, and we'll light a little fire under him and see if he can schedule a little time for you for sure. He would be a great guest for you.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping to meet him again in Manchester in July, I think it is, at the Awakening, because he's coming over, isn't he? So
well, there you go.
Perhaps if you give him
Wonderful.
a nudge and tell him I'll pop over and say hello to him.
Can do.
So I might get a little chance of a short interview at that point. But
I'm sure you can arrange that. Most of us make ourselves available for just that sort of thing at conferences. Yeah. And if you learn that any of the speakers for the event get sick, drop out, or abducted by aliens, let them know I'm available.
Yeah, I will do. I will do. Have you got any further TV appearances planned, or
yeah,
not you planned, but you've been invited to?
I'll be at the UFO MegaCon in the end of next month. That's the last week in March. I will be at the Pine Bush, New York UFO Festival and Conference coming up in May. I will be back for the Roswell, New Mexico Conference and Festival in the first week of July. Exeter, New Hampshire in the first weekend of September, and so on down the line. I keep posting upcoming dates on my Facebook page, and desperately need to update my website, which is my name and initials of my home state, peterrobbinsny.com. But yeah, a bunch coming at me, and I hope
I will make sure that a lot of these links go on the Paranormal Dimensions page, because I've got a page that's directly for this program, so I will put a lot of that on there for you.
Great.
So yeah, it's been fantastic, Peter. I mean, one last question I've got for you.
Sure.
We've got 2 minutes.
Yep.
What do you like best about all the ufology?
About ufology? About the field?
Yeah. What do you like best? In a nutshell.
Yeah. You know what? Making contact, real contact with good people from all over the world that I would have never met otherwise, and occasionally getting to visit places that I would never see otherwise. This is a perfect example. Getting to spend a couple of hours with you, David, a friend that I haven't seen in a few years, knowing that this is going out to other people, some of whom are friends, some who are acquaintances, some who don't know me, that I don't know, but getting to, I'd like to think, produce a positive impact in people's lives, address their open minds about a subject that is incredibly important. Implications for humanity can draw us all closer together. And Lord knows we need that, especially in this day and age.
Yeah. Well, this does go right out across the US, so hopefully quite a few people will get to listen to this. It gets repeated quite a bit, and it goes onto YouTube, so it's going to be around forever, Peter.
Well, that's great, and make a point. And once you broadcast it, to post it on my page and the link and wherever else you can, so we can get it out there, and people will you'll build up a listenership as well. You deserve it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and overall, I know that you've done the one show already with Sasha. Just great luck to you with this show. I hope it becomes something that really reaches a lot of people and that you find very satisfying.
Yeah, it seemed to have gone down well anyway. I just did one with Malcolm Robinson actually last weekend.
Oh, terrific. So lovely guy.
A 2-hour show with him coming out, which will be Monday next.
Another person with plenty of material to cover.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I had so much in front of me, it was difficult to dive into first, you know.
Yeah.
That was fantastic.
You're welcome, David. It was fun. And for me, this is the kind of show that I like doing most, where you basically just have a freewheeling discussion, have a chance to go off on topics. Occasionally, very rarely, I have a host, almost always well-meaning, but overly enthused, and they get so caught up that they start to, oh yeah, let me tell you about this, and you realize, wait a minute, I'm sitting here for 10 minutes now waiting to talk. You know, it's an interesting story, but you could have done that without me. Yeah. So, yeah, you being a good listener and directing the conversation where you want it to go, and getting more and more of an intuition of what your listeners are going to want to hear, that's what's going to make you an outstanding player in the field. Just keep doing it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it helped me a lot with you giving me some notes to, with questions to ask you. It helped me a lot. And I've learned from that, because whenever I get guests on again, I'm going to ask them the same question. I'm going to say,
absolutely,
have you got questions you want me to ask you?
And in fact,
because it is your show, not mine.
Yeah. Occasionally, another thing that comes up for me is somebody that gets you on. It's usually a smaller podcast, and I don't turn anybody down. Occasionally it's like, oh God, that's like 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. my time. I just can't do that. You know, I can stay up late, but I don't think so. Somebody who doesn't really know what they want. And so talk about yourself. Tell us, who you are and what you do. Okay, tell us more about who you are and what you do. Okay, it's terrible. I don't like to be in that situation.
I know some of them are a bit of a struggle. I've had that on a couple of shows myself.
Is with some hosts, they either, your colleagues, your friends, you've done the show before. I have one show in the States. It's called 21st Century Radio. I haven't done it for a year or so, but I've been a guest on the show more than 25 times, going back like 25 years. And, these people are old friends, but it's like, what's new? Anything special you want to cover? Where other shows, small and large, and it's a great idea. And I mean really large, like Coast to Coast, which is sort of the biggest one, out there. They are always smart enough to say, give us 10 potential talking points of things that, you're up for talking about, or that you feel we should direct the, conversation toward. So never feel awkward about that. Occasionally you probably get a potential guest that'll say, hey, I don't need that extra work. Hey, if you can't take 5 minutes out of your time to give your radio host the opportunity to let you shine and ask you questions that you're ready to go on or engaged with, or, you're passionate about, you shouldn't be on the show anyway. So yeah, just make that part of your thing. It can be very freewheeling. If you've got about 10 points of things that you'd like me to ask you, I will maybe choose some of those. I've got my own questions, but it leaves you in a much better place to start as you were with our show.
Yeah, it did help me a lot. And
Cool.
I have to say, I've learnt from that, and I think I will be doing that in the future. Anyway, thanks ever so much, Peter. Maybe in a few months we can do this again, if you're up to it.
Sure. Just let me know.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And
okay, be well, my friend.
Yeah, much respect to you, mate. Thank you.
You too.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to Paranormal Dimensions. I'm David Young, and this is the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Please tune in again next week. Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.